You can usually tell if you know what you're looking for. It's in the way some people apologize before they ask for anything, the way they thank you twice for things that didn't require thanking once, the way they go quiet when their father comes up in conversation, or change the subject, or make a joke that isn't quite a joke. The way they describe their childhood, and you notice, halfway through, that one parent is doing all the work in the story, and the other one is just a name, or a chair, or an absence the storyteller has gotten so used to that they don't even know they're walking around it. If you grew up with an absent father, you already know what I am about to say. You may not have words for it yet, but you will recognize the words when they arrive. That recognition is what brought you here. Something in you is tired of carrying a thing you cannot quite name, and you are hoping that if someone names it accurately, you might be able to set it down. Every culture has tried to name what happened to you. The Greeks gave us the Odyssey, half of which is about a son named Telemachus setting out to find a father he had never met, on the assumption that a son without a father is incomplete until the father returns. The Romans built fatherhood into law itself, patria potestas, the father's power, so total that his absence created not just emotional vacancy, but legal vacuum. The medieval theologians built God in the shape of a father precisely because the father's blessing was understood as the structural origin of legitimacy itself. The Freudians, late and reductively, made the father into the figure against whom the self had to be defined. The Jungians, more carefully, made the father into an archetype, the principle of structure, of the world outside the home, of the call into what you were meant to become. In ordinary speech, outside any of these traditions, it is what you have probably called it your whole life. My dad wasn't around. Or he was there, but he wasn't really there. Or, the most common one, the one you have probably said with a shrug that did not reflect what was happening inside you while you said it. It's fine, I'm over it. You are not over it. That is not a criticism. It is a relief, if you can let it be one. You were not supposed to be over it. Nobody is over it. The people who appear to be over it have either done the work this video is about, or they have built such elaborate defenses around the wound that they no longer feel it, which is not the same as being healed, even though from the outside it can look identical. What happened to you was not nothing. It was not a non-event because there was no single scene to point to. It was not unimportant because everyone in your life kept telling you that other kids had it worse. It was something specific and shaping, and the shaping is still happening in ways you may not yet have connected to its source. We are going to connect them. This is not a small or occasional faculty of human development. Your father, present or absent, attentive or distracted, was the original blueprint for half of what you would later come to know about safety, about authority, about provision, about the world outside your mother's arms. When he was there and he was well, the blueprint was laid quietly and you did not notice the laying. When he was absent, or when he was present but unreachable, the blueprint was laid anyway, but it was laid around the absence. The shape of the missing thing became the shape of the architecture, and the architecture is the architecture you have been inhabiting your whole life. You did not choose it. You did not build it consciously. You were too young, but you are old enough now to see it. And seeing it is the first thing that can change. There is a temptation when you start to take this seriously to inflate it, to believe that every difficulty you have ever had traces back to a single missing man, that the wound is total, that nothing else matters quite as much as this. That temptation is understandable, especially in the early stages of waking up to what happened to you. Everything starts to look like the father wound, because once you can see it everywhere. But the closer you look at what your father's absence actually is, the stranger and more ordinary it becomes at once. It is not that one missing presence ruined everything in your life. It is that a missing presence shaped a developing self in specific, predictable, and largely repairable ways. And most of what you are still struggling with comes not from the original absence, but from the adaptations you made, without knowing you were making them, to survive it. The wound was the absence. The pattern is the adaptation. They are not the same thing, and learning to tell them apart is most of the work we are about to do. The architecture of the missing room. The voice that narrates your inner world did not arrive whole. It was assembled, slowly, from the voices you heard as a child. Your mother's voice became one room inside you. Your father's voice was supposed to become another. Siblings, teachers, the textures of your home itself. These were the materials out of which you constructed the internal building you now call yourself. When a father is absent, the room he was meant to furnish does not stay empty. The child fills it. You filled it. You had to. A self cannot have an empty room at its center any more than a house can have a missing wall. So you reached as a child for whatever materials were available: an uncle, a coach, a teacher you liked, a fictional character you loved, an athlete or a musician or an actor you watched obsessively. Sometimes your mother forced into double duty, sometimes the wound itself given a voice and made to speak. What ended up in that room is rarely a good substitute for what was supposed to be there, because the substitutes were not chosen by an adult mind capable of evaluating them. They were chosen by a child trying to complete an architecture they did not have the tools to complete. If you reached for your friend's father, that uncle who picked you up from school, the coach who once told you he was proud of you and you remembered the moment for the next 20 years, you filed away a partial and idealized model. If you reached for a media figure, you filed away a flat one. If you reached for your mother's bitterness toward the father who left, you filed away a model in which the father shape is rage-shaped, and you have been carrying that rage shape into every future encounter with male authority for decades. This is why, when you walk into a meeting and your new boss reminds you of something you cannot quite place, your body responds before your mind catches up. This is why certain men make you instantly defensive for reasons you cannot articulate, and why other men make you trust them more than they have earned. This is why your reaction to authority is rarely proportional to the actual person in front of you. You are not responding to them, you are responding to the architecture. Think about the last time you reacted to a man in your life, a partner, a boss, a stranger, a friend, and you knew, somewhere underneath the reacting, that the reaction was too big for what was happening. You probably told yourself you were tired, or stressed, or just having a bad day. You probably did not tell yourself that you were standing in a room you built when you were 6, with furniture you chose when you had no idea what you were doing, and you were experiencing the present moment through that room's lighting. That is what is happening. Not always. Not in every interaction. But often enough that it explains things you have not been able to explain to yourself. The painful truth, and the one that developmental research keeps confirming, is that the architecture got built whether or not your father showed up. The room was constructed, it was furnished. You have been inhabiting it, and you did not know, because no child can know, that the furniture you assembled in panic from whatever was nearby was not the furniture you would have lived with if your father had been present to bring his own. When you become a parent yourself, you do not parent freshly. You parent from inside the architecture, often repeating the absence in subtle forms you swore you would never repeat. Sometimes overcorrecting into a smothering presence that is its own kind of absence because you have no calibrated model of what the middle would have looked like. If you have ever caught yourself doing the exact thing you promised yourself you would never do, going silent, working too much, leaving the room when things get hard, that is not a moral failure. That is the architecture doing what architectures do. It is repeating itself because that is the only blueprint it has. You can change that. We will get to how. But first, you have to see the architecture, because as long as it is invisible to you, it is what is running the building. 2 kinds of absence. It is worth being precise here, because the word absent is doing more work than one word can carry, and you may be uncertain whether what happened to you counts. There is the physical absence, the father who left when you were too young to remember, the father who was never named on the birth certificate, the father who died, the father who was incarcerated or deployed or simply gone for reasons that may have had nothing to do with you. If this is your story, you have probably had to explain it more times than you wanted to, in school forms and conversations and the small social moments when other people's fathers come up casually and your story does not have a casual version. Then there is the harder absence, the one that does not have a single agreed upon name, and that you may not have realized counts. The father who lived in your house but was not in your life. The father who provided materially but could not be reached emotionally. The father who came home from work and disappeared into the television, or the garage, or the bottle, or the silence at the end of the dinner table. The father who was consumed by his own depression, his rage, his addiction, his work, his unhappiness, his unprocessed inheritance from his own father. The father who was, for all practical purposes, a piece of furniture in the house you grew up in. If this is your story, you may have spent your whole life feeling that you have no right to claim a wound, because technically, he was there. He paid for things. He came to some of your games. He showed up at the holidays. You were not abandoned in the way that other people were abandoned. And so when you try to put words to the loneliness that defined your childhood, the words feel like an exaggeration, like a betrayal of the people who had it worse. I want to say this clearly. The developmental research has shown, again and again, that these two absences produce remarkably similar internal architectures. The child who never knew their father and the child who lived in the same house as a father who never knew them often arrive in adulthood with the same patterns of attachment, the same difficulties with authority, the same restless searching, the same uncertainty about what a man is supposed to be or do or feel. The wound is not the geography. The wound is the unmet need for what fathers, when they are well, provide. If you grew up with the second kind of absence, you have permission to call it what it was. Your wound is real. The fact that nobody named it does not mean it did not happen. The fact that he sat at the table does not mean he was there. What is it that fathers, when they are well, actually provide? It is worth saying plainly because the culture has spent the last 50 years uncertain about whether fathers provide anything specific at all, and the research has, more quietly, settled on an answer. Fathers, when they are well, give 3 things that mothers, however good, cannot fully provide on their own. The first is a second model of being a self in the world. A second example of how an adult inhabits a body, makes decisions, faces difficulty, returns from difficulty, loves, fails, repairs. If you only had one model growing up, you only have one example of how to be a person, and your sense of what is possible was narrower than it would have been with 2. The second is a calibrated relationship with risk and challenge. The research is consistent that fathers tend to engage children in more physically robust, more challenging, more provocatively playful interaction, and that this kind of engagement builds in the child a sense of what their body can do and what risk they can survive. If this was missing, you may have grown into an adult who either avoids risk entirely or who courts it recklessly with no calibrated middle. The third is the introduction of the outside world. The father, historically and developmentally, is the figure who represents the world beyond the home, who makes that world feel approachable and whose blessing or withdrawal shapes the child's confidence about entering it. When any of these were missing from your childhood, you constructed without them. You may have constructed beautifully. Many fatherless children do. You may have found mentors. You may have read voraciously. You may have built a self that looks from outside indistinguishable from someone who had every advantage. But the construction took work that you should not have had to do, and the work left marks. The marks are what we are tracing. If you are recognizing yourself in this, that recognition is not a complaint. It is the beginning of understanding why the thing you have been carrying has been so heavy. It was supposed to be carried by 2 people. You have been carrying it alone. The architecture of the missing room differs by who you are, not because the wound is different, but because the room being filled is differently shaped depending on what you needed your father to model for you. If you are a son, your father was the first answer to a question you have probably spent your whole life refining without realizing you were refining it. What is a man? And am I one? And how would I know? When a father is present and well, this question gets answered casually in 1,000 small moments. How a man speaks to a waiter, how a man handles being wrong, how a man cries, how a man does not cry, how a man comes home from work and decompresses, how a man treats the boy's mother, how a man treats himself. The son does not have to ask the question because the answer is being offered continuously. In a register, he can read without translating. When the father is absent, the question stays open. You had to find the answer somewhere. And if you are honest with yourself about where you found it, the answer is probably uncomfortable. You may have found it in older boys whose own fathers were also absent and who were therefore performing manhood rather than being it. You may have found it in media, in action movies, in rappers, in athletes, in podcasters, in influencers whose business model depends on selling certainty about what a man is to young men who do not have a quiet internal model of one. You may have spent years overcorrecting into a performance of toughness because you had no quiet example of strength, or undercorrecting into a deliberate softness because every model you had encountered seemed either absent or violent, and neither felt survivable. If you have spent your adult life with a restless feeling that you are not quite a real man, or that other men know something you do not, or that you are performing maleness for an invisible audience whose approval you cannot quite earn, that feeling is not a character flaw. That feeling is the open question, still waiting for the answer your father did not give you. The good news is that you can answer it yourself now, as an adult, more accurately than any external figure could ever have answered it for you. The work of doing so is part of what this video is for. If you are a daughter, your father was the first answer to a different question. What is it to be loved by a man, and what is it to be safe in the presence of male power? A present, well-functioning father teaches a daughter, without ever stating it, that she is valuable not for what she does for him, but for who she is, that male attention can be safe, that a man can be reliable and present without being intrusive, that the world outside the home contains men who will treat her the way her father treated her. When the father is absent, you constructed from absence. You may have spent your adult life drawn to men who replicate the original absence, because the architecture of the missing room has made absence feel like home, and emotionally available men feel foreign and slightly suspect. You may have a pattern of falling for men who are unavailable, taken, distant, work-obsessed, addicted, married, geographically impossible. And you may have told yourself many stories about why this keeps happening, none of which quite explain it. The architecture explains it. The architecture is doing exactly what it was built to do. Or you may have gone the other direction, choosing men whose presence was so total that it suffocated, mistaking smothering for safety because you had no calibrated middle. You may have found yourself in relationships where you slowly disappeared, where your needs became smaller and smaller until you could not find them anymore, where you woke up one morning at 35 or 40 and did not recognize the woman you had become. If any of this is your story, I want to name something that the culture rarely names. You are not broken. You are not bad at relationships. You did not pick the wrong men because there is something wrong with you. You picked the men your architecture recognized. The architecture was built by a child trying to make sense of a father-shaped absence, and the architecture has been running the selection process for as long as you have been dating. The pattern is not a flaw in you. The pattern is a feature of an architecture that was never updated because nobody told you it could be. It can be. We will get there. The adaptations that looked like strengths. You probably became one of these, maybe more than one. Read these slowly, because if you recognize yourself in one of them, you are about to understand something about your own life that has been hiding in plain sight. You may have become the responsible one. You matured early. You took on burdens that other children your age were not expected to carry. You became the family interpreter, the second parent to your siblings, the one who noticed what needed to be done and did it without being asked. People praised you for it. Adults told your mother how lucky she was. Teachers wrote on your report cards that you were mature for your age. You took this praise to be a description of who you were, and you have been performing maturity ever since. But it was not maturity. It was the substitution of duty for development. The child who is taking care of their mother emotionally or their younger siblings logistically is not getting to be a child. You skipped a stage. And if you are now in your 20s or 30s or 40s and you find yourself sometimes with an inexplicable desire to fall apart, to be taken care of, to not have to be the one who has it together, that desire is not weakness. It is the child you never got to be, still in there, still waiting for the rest you were never permitted. You may have become the high achiever. You drove yourself harder than your peers, accumulated accomplishments, built a career or a body or a reputation that looked from outside like the natural product of talent and effort. You probably tell yourself that you just have high standards. You probably do. But ask yourself what happens when you accomplish the thing you have been chasing. Notice the gap, the strange empty moment when you expected to feel satisfied and instead felt nothing, or felt briefly satisfied and then immediately needed a new target. That gap is the architecture. The engine underneath your achievement is not the love of the work, though that may be real too. The engine, underneath everything, is the search for a validation that the original architecture cannot supply, because the figure whose validation would have completed the room is not present to give it. So you seek the validation in achievement, in credentials, in the approval of authority figures who can be made to stand in, briefly, for the missing father. The achievements are real. The hunger underneath them does not subside when you arrive. You may have become intensely independent. You learned not to need. You learned, somewhere very early, that needing was the original mistake, because needing produced no response, and the lesson of unresponded to need is that needing is dangerous and self-sufficiency is safer. So you became the person who can do everything alone. You became uncomfortable receiving help. You may have noticed that you cannot quite let your partner take care of you when you are sick, that you flinch when a friend offers to do you a favor, that you would rather struggle in private than ask anyone for anything. People call this independence. They admire it. They tell you they wish they were more like you. What they do not see is what it costs you every day to maintain the architecture in which you cannot need anyone. The architecture was built to protect you from the unbearable possibility of needing and not being met. The architecture worked. It also kept you alone. You may have become the people pleaser. You learned early to read rooms, to anticipate what others needed, to provide it before being asked, because you learned that being needed was the safest way to be loved. You became indispensable to others and slowly disappeared from yourself. You are praised for your kindness and your attentiveness, and you may have built your entire identity around being the person who is good to others. But the kindness is not a gift freely given. It is a service rendered in exchange for a presence that the architecture taught you would otherwise not earn. If you have ever caught yourself, late at night, exhausted from a day of being everything to everyone, wondering bitterly why nobody ever asks how you are doing, that bitterness is information. The architecture has been operating a transaction your conscious mind never agreed to, and the bill is coming due. The narrator pauses. A brief voice insert here. Perhaps a short clip of Gabor Mate or a similar voice on the way children adapt to absence by becoming what the environment seems to require. The narrator returns and repeats the central line, slowly, with weight. The adaptation that allowed the child to survive becomes the adaptation that prevents the adult from being fully alive. I want you to hear that twice, because most of what we are about to do depends on it. The adaptation that allowed the child to survive becomes the adaptation that prevents the adult from being fully alive. The adaptations were intelligent. They were not weaknesses. They were the reason you made it to adulthood with your core self intact. There is no shame in any of them, and if you have spent any part of this video feeling ashamed, please set the shame down. Your child self did exactly what an intelligent child does in an impossible situation. It survived. You are here. That is not a small accomplishment. But the impossible situation is no longer the situation. The adaptation is now running in a context where its original logic no longer applies. The responsible child is now a responsible adult who cannot rest. The high achiever is now an adult whose accomplishments do not satisfy. The independent one is now an adult who cannot let anyone close. The pleaser is now an adult who has lost track of what they themselves want. The adaptations were intelligent. They are now in the way. The good news, and I want you to hear this, is that you can update them. They are not your personality. They are circuits laid down by a child, running on outdated assumptions. The circuits can be examined. The assumptions can be revised. The architecture can be renovated. Not quickly, and not by force, but slowly, by attention, by patience, by giving yourself the kind of supervision the original construction did not have. 5. What your body has been remembering. The deeper mind speaks almost always through the body, and your father's absence lives in your body in ways you may not yet have traced. Notice, Right now, where you are holding tension, notice your shoulders, notice your jaw, notice the soft area beneath your collarbones, the front of your chest, the back of your neck. There is a particular kind of bracing that the fatherless adult tends to carry in the upper body, a chronic muscular preparation for an impact that is not coming and has not come in 20 years, but the body has not been told the impact is no longer expected. So it braces all day, every day. You probably do not notice it because it is the only state your body has ever known. The bracing is what you call being yourself. You think it is your personality. It is not. It is an old circuit that has been running since before you had words. The neurologist Stephen Porges spent decades developing what is now called polyvagal theory, and one of his consistent findings is this: early relational deprivation produces durable changes in the way the nervous system reads the social environment, biasing it toward threat detection in contexts where threat is not actually present. Translated out of clinical language, this means, if you grew up in an environment where a key adult presence was unreliable, your nervous system learned to be on guard, and the on-guardness did not go away just because you got older. Your body, right now, may be scanning for danger in rooms where there is no danger. It may be reading neutral male faces as hostile. It may be tightening in response to a tone of voice that reminds it of something it never quite forgot. This is why, if you grew up with an absent or unpredictable father, you may startle more easily than other people. You may flinch at sudden movements. You may have noticed that when a man raises his voice in your vicinity, even at someone else, even on a video, even at a sports event on television, something in your chest tightens before you have time to think. That tightening is not weakness. It is your nervous system doing the job your nervous system learned to do when you were 3 or 4 or 5, scanning for a danger that is no longer in the room but that your body has not yet been convinced has left. There is also a particular relationship that the fatherless adult tends to have with their own anger, and it is worth noticing where you sit in this. If you are a son and your father was present but rage-prone, you may carry anger as something dangerous to be suppressed at all costs, terrified that if you ever let it out, you will become him. Or, just as common, you may carry his anger inside you and find it leaking out in ways you cannot control, hating yourself afterward, swearing you will not do it again, doing it again. If your father was absent, you may have no model for anger at all, and so you either freeze when anger is required of you, or you flail at it like someone using a tool they have never seen before. If you were a daughter, you may have watched your father's anger provoke your mother's distress, and learned, somewhere very young, that anger is what makes the people you depend on go away. So you carry your own anger with suspicion, swallowing it, redirecting it, turning it inward against yourself. You become a woman who cannot quite say no, who cannot quite name when she has been wronged, whose body knows long before her mouth does that something is unacceptable, but whose mouth has been trained not to speak. In both cases, your body has been managing anger as a hazardous material rather than as ordinary information, and the management is exhausting, and the exhaustion is part of why you are tired in a way that sleep does not fix. The therapy of this, when it is well done, is largely somatic. Not because talking does not help, it does, but because the wound lives below talking, and to reach it, you have to reach the body. The slow re-education of the nervous system. The practice of noticing the bracing without immediately overriding it. The patient cultivation of a felt sense of safety that the architecture never had the chance to build. This is not fast work. It is not dramatic. From the outside, it looks like nothing much is happening. But your body, it turns out, is patient. It will wait as long as it takes. It has been waiting your whole life. It is waiting now while you watch this. You can feel it if you let yourself. 6. The search you did not know you were on. There is a pattern in the lives of adults who grew up without a father, and it is one of the most consistently described in the clinical literature, and the people inside it almost never see it from the inside. The pattern is the search. You have been constructing your life, without knowing it, around the project of finding what the architecture is missing. You experience yourself as making ordinary choices, A romantic partner, a career, a mentor, a community, a religious tradition, a political identity. You do not notice that across all these ordinary choices runs a single thread, and the thread is the search for the Father. If you are a woman who has noticed that your romantic partners keep being older or more established or more authoritative than would otherwise make sense, you experience yourself as drawn to maturity, to stability, to the calm an older man represents. The architecture is doing the work below your awareness. The work is the work of completing the missing room. Sometimes the relationship is a good one, and the architecture finds something it was looking for. More often, the architecture overloads the relationship with expectations no romantic partner can meet, because the partner is being asked to be both a husband and the father who was not there, and the two roles are not compatible. The relationship strains under the impossibility. You do not understand why you keep feeling disappointed in men who, on paper, are doing nothing wrong. The reason is that they are not your father, and they were never going to be, and no human being could have been. If you are a man who has noticed that you keep attaching yourself to charismatic, older male figures, a boss, a mentor, a guru, a coach, a podcaster, a political leader, a religious teacher, you experience yourself as drawn to wisdom, to leadership, to the call of something larger than yourself. The architecture is doing the work. The figure becomes the structural placeholder for the missing father, and the relationship absorbs energies and projections that no human figure can sustain. When the figure inevitably disappoints you, and they do because they are human and not architectural elements, the disappointment is catastrophic in a way that surprises you because it is not proportional to the actual failure. It is proportional to the original wound, which was waiting for a chance to be triggered, and the figure provided it. The search takes many forms, and you may recognize yourself in more than one. Some people search through religion, building elaborate relationships with God as Father that may be sustaining or may be a perpetuation of the original architecture, depending on how the relationship is held. Some search through political identification, attaching to ideologies organized around strong father figures and feeling, for the first time, that they belong somewhere. Some search through addiction, which is, among other things, a chemical attempt to produce in the body the felt sense of safety and presence that the architecture never installed. I want to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with yourself about the answer, not out loud, just in the privacy of your own head. Who have you been searching for? If you sit with the question, the answer often surfaces faster than you expect. It might be a specific kind of man. It might be a specific kind of approval. It might be a specific feeling that you have been chasing across decades. The feeling of finally being chosen, finally being seen, finally being told that you are enough by the figure who never said it. The painful and clarifying thing about recognizing the search is that the search does not end by being satisfied. It cannot be. The figure you have been searching for does not exist in the form your architecture is requesting, because that form was a child's projection, and adult human beings cannot fulfill childhood projections no matter how much they love you. The search ends instead by being seen. When you recognize that you have been searching for years, that the partners, the mentors, the credentials, the ideologies, the moves across the country, the new careers, the new selves were all variations of the same project, something shifts. The search does not disappear, but it stops being unconscious. It becomes something you can hold in your hand and examine, rather than something that is silently driving you through life. And the holding is the first real possibility of choice. The search will keep wanting to run. The architecture will keep generating new candidates for the missing room. But once you have seen the search, you can ask each time whether this particular pursuit is a free choice or a continuation of the original project. The asking does not always produce the right answer, but the asking is the difference between living architecturally and living freely. You are allowed to stop searching. You did not know you were doing it. Now you know. That is enough to begin. Your mother in the middle. It is necessary in any honest treatment of the absent father to speak about your mother, because she is almost always in the middle of the situation, and what she did with the absence shaped you as much as the absence itself. I want to say at the beginning of this section that this is going to be the hardest part for some of you, and I want you to stay with me through it. Your mother is the person who was probably most heroically present in your childhood, and what I am about to say is not a criticism of her. It is the more complicated truth that two things can be true at once, and that loving someone fully includes seeing them clearly, and that you are old enough now to see your mother clearly without losing your love for her. Some mothers, in the absence of the father, become the entire emotional world of the child. They love completely and they love alone. The relationship they build with the child is sustaining in many ways, but also tends, by its structural shape, to make the child responsible for the mother's emotional life in a way that no child is developmentally equipped to bear. You may have grown up as your mother's confidant, her companion, her best friend, her audience, the one who knew what nobody else knew. This is not a flaw of her love. It is what happens when love is concentrated by the absence of the other adult who was supposed to receive part of it. But the child raised in this concentrated love often grows up with a sense of merged identity. You cannot quite tell where you end and your mother begins. And this becomes a difficulty in adult intimacy that you will only later be able to name. If you have ever felt suffocated in a romantic relationship without being able to explain why, or guilty for wanting space from your mother that other adults seem entitled to without guilt, this is the architecture. Some mothers, in the absence of the father, become the carrier of the wound. They speak of the father with bitterness, with grief, with a complicated combination that you did not have the framework to pass as a child. You learned, from these references, what to think of the father, and underneath that, what to think of men. You learned that men were dangerous, or that men left, or that men could not be trusted. This learning was laid down before you had any way to evaluate it, and it became the substrate on which every later relationship with men was built. Your mother was not lying. She was doing her best with a wound she did not deserve. But you were receiving the wound secondhand, and the secondhand wound has shaped your adult life anyway. Some mothers, in the absence of the father, worked themselves to exhaustion and became, in their own way, partially absent. They were providing materially. They were providing extraordinarily, given the circumstances. But they were running so hard that the emotional bandwidth that would have been available to them in a two-parent household was not available, and you experienced a second, quieter absence layered on top of the first. This is no one's fault. It is the structure of single parenthood in a culture that has not built the support systems single parents would need. But you are the one who lived inside the structure, and the structure produced its effects regardless of how morally innocent everyone in it was. There is a particular grief that adult children of absent fathers often arrive at, late, when they finally come to see their mother fully. The mother who was heroic in her efforts. The mother who was also, sometimes, doing harm without meaning to, because the impossible situation she was in required someone to absorb impossible costs, and the only person available to absorb them was you. The grief is not blame. The grief is the recognition that your mother was also a person doing her best inside an architecture not of her making, and that you carried what she could not carry, and that nobody in the situation was the villain. The villain, if there has to be one, is the absence itself. And the absence is not a person. The absence is what happens when a structure fails to hold, and the failure of structures is one of the oldest and most ordinary tragedies in human life. And it is not made better by being either personalized or denied. It is made better slowly by being seen. You can love your mother and grieve what she could not give you, both, at the same time. You do not have to choose. The love does not erase the grief. The grief does not diminish the love. This is one of the harder things adulthood asks of us, and you are doing it right now by being willing to look at this honestly. That is not disloyalty. That is the kind of love that has finally grown up. The adult returning home. There is a final realization that this whole way of looking at the absent father tends to lead toward, and it is gentler than most people expect. You are not condemned to live inside the original architecture. The architecture was built without supervision, but you can supervise its renovation. The room that was furnished badly can be unfurnished and furnished again. The body that learned to brace can learn to unbrace. The search that has been running for 30 years can stop running, not because it was wrong to search, but because you have seen it now, and the seen search is no longer required to be unconscious. This is not a quick process. It is the work of a life, or at least a long stretch of one. It happens in therapy, if you can find a good therapist. It happens in close friendship with people who can witness you accurately and patiently. It happens in slow self-observation, the kind that does not require any external apparatus, just the willingness to notice what you are doing while you are doing it. It happens in the patient cultivation of a felt sense of safety that the original architecture did not provide. It happens in the willingness to be loved by people who are not the missing father, and to let their love be its own thing rather than a substitute for what was missing. It also happens, slowly, in the willingness to forgive your father. Not because he deserves it, in many cases, he does not, but because the unforgiving is a form of continued residence inside the architecture, and the renovation cannot fully proceed until the architect has been allowed to be a person rather than a wound. Forgiveness here is not about him. It is about you. You are not absolving him. You are releasing yourself from the contract you signed when you were 5, which committed you to spending the rest of your life proving that he was wrong to leave, or wrong to stay while being gone, or wrong to be whoever he was. He may have been wrong. The wrongness is not what is keeping you stuck. What is keeping you stuck is the contract, and the contract is yours to tear up. For most adult children of absent fathers, the father does not return. He stays absent, or he dies absent, or he is alive but unreachable, and the healing has to happen without him. This is harder, but it is not impossible. What it requires is the recognition that the missing father was never going to be the source of the healing anyway. The healing was always going to come from elsewhere, from the slow internal work of becoming the kind of adult who can mother and father themselves, who can offer to their own inner child the steady, calm, attentive presence that was not offered in childhood, who can build, brick by brick, and as an adult, the architecture that was supposed to have been given but was not. This is what the deepest therapeutic traditions across every culture have always called becoming whole. It is not the absence of wound, it is the integration of wound. It is the moment at which the wound stops being the loudest voice in the architecture and becomes one voice among many, one voice in the council taking its turn, no longer required to drown out the others because it has finally, after all this time, been heard. You will not become the adult you would have been if your father had been present. That adult does not exist and cannot be summoned, and I want you to grieve that, because the grief is real, and not grieving it is part of what keeps the wound active. What you can become is something else, an adult who knows, with a precision most people do not have, what was missing, and who has spent years learning to offer it to yourself and to others. This is not a consolation prize. It is a particular kind of wisdom that only the fatherless tend to develop, and it is one of the reasons that so many of the most attentive parents, the most present partners, the most thoughtful friends in any community are people who grew up without a father and decided, somewhere in their 20s or 30s or 40s, that the absence would end with them. That can be you. It probably already is you, in ways you have not yet given yourself credit for. If you have ever shown up for someone the way nobody showed up for you, you are already doing the work. If you have ever stayed present when it would have been easier to disappear, you are already breaking the chain. If you have ever caught yourself about to do the thing your father did and chose, instead, to do something else, even something imperfect, you have already become the renovation. This is what the wound of the absent father, in the end, is asking for. Not faith, not blind forgiveness, not even reconciliation exactly. Just attention, the willingness to see the architecture for what it is, the willingness to do the slow renovation, the willingness to become, for yourself and for those you love, the presence that was missing, not because you are obligated to fix what someone else broke, but because doing so is how the chain is broken and how the next generation gets to inherit something other than what was inherited. This is the small and beautiful thing the long study of the absent father has always been pointing at. Not the recovery of what was lost, not the magical return of the man who did not stay. Just the slow, patient, ancestral work of becoming, in your own adulthood, the presence the architecture was waiting for. Your father was absent. The child you were grew up around the absence. The adult you are now is doing the renovation. The renovation is enough. It has been the work all along. And you have been doing it in your own way, in your own time, even on the days when you thought you were failing, even on the days when the architecture won. You are doing it right now by sitting with this, by letting yourself recognize what was hard to recognize, by being honest with yourself about what you have been carrying. You are not alone in there, even when it felt like you were. The wisest part of you has been working on this your whole life, quietly, beneath the noise, waiting for the moment you were ready to hear it. You are ready now, and the part of you that was waiting, it has been with you the whole time.